Brothers and sisters, on behalf of the officers, staff, and members of the Riverside Church, and particularly the Commission for Mission and Social Justice of our church, I am honored to have the opportunity to welcome you to this evening of inspiration and challenge. As I stand to welcome you, I am only an echo that attempts to continue the voice of reason in support of peace and justice, which has been sounded from this place since its dedication in 1931. This building, put here so that the people of the city of New York could gather in a place to be inspired and empowered to help build a world which is safe for all God's children. Through the years, representatives from all around the world have come to this place and has stood here to speak about the prospect that when we know the truth, we all shall be free. Tonight is a very special opportunity, for we all know that with all of the changes going on in this age of globalization, and in the wake of wars and rumors of war, in time of terror, militaristic, and also of ideas, we come together that we might hear some truth that may help us to find the path to peace and to justice and for the integrity of creation. And so, this place, where we often like to talk about speaking truth to power, this place has learned that to know the truth, to speak to power, we need to hear the truth that comes from persons who have not always been viewed as powerful. For when we hear from the people, we get an intimation of the voice of the Eternal One. And even a whisper from the people, when that whisper reflects respect for all God's people, that whisper becomes a thunderous roar. So tonight, we at the Riverside Church are happy to be united with the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and to be a place that once again gets the opportunity to listen for some truth. And if the truth you hear tonight from Arundhati Roy is in resonance with the truth in your heart, then perhaps we can become a critical mass of awakened brothers and sisters, ready to go forth and embody the power of humanity as reflected through the people. So, be at home here tonight. Let your spirit soar. We are going to hear some truth, and we're going to march out and do something about it. God bless you all.
On behalf of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, let me start by thanking everyone for coming here to share in this evening of solidarity and truth-telling. All of us at CESR are honored to be a part of the beautiful spirit present here tonight. I know that we're all eagerly anticipating Arundhati Roy's talk, but I hope you won't mind if I take some time to tell you a little about how CESR got started and what we do. 3 weeks after the first Gulf War ended in 1991, a group of graduate students traveled to Iraq for the purpose of collecting accurate information about the human face of collateral damage. We were young, idealistic, and outraged by the uncritical media and therefore public acceptance of the Pentagon's carefully packaged drama of clean war and smart weapons. Above all, we didn't like being lied to by our own government. And we still don't like being lied to by our government, especially not in the name of democracy and freedom. We traveled throughout Iraq and came to learn the real lesson of modern war: bomb now, die later. We found that the entire civilian infrastructure had been destroyed: electric power stations, water and sewage plants, food warehouses, factories, phone lines, roads and bridges. Hospitals could no longer refrigerate medicines. People couldn't even turn on the kitchen tap for a glass of clean water. We documented a threefold increase in child mortality, that's children under the age of 5, due largely to simple diarrhea. Our research made front-page headlines around the world. Officials in both Washington and Baghdad deplored the tragic loss of life, but simply blamed it on each other. The UN Security Council discussed the need for humanitarian relief, but continued to impose crippling economic sanctions. No one accepted responsibility for the undeniable fact that Iraqis were dying every day, especially children of the poor and the powerless. 2 years after this mission, we established the Center for Economic and Social Rights to challenge this kind of injustice as a violation of international human rights. We seek legal accountability for those who perpetuate the crime of poverty. Our mandate is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes that rights to health, education, housing, food, work, and social security are equally fundamental to human dignity as the right to free expression. When we started as a 3-person outfit here in New York, economic and social rights had been ignored globally for decades, another victim of Cold War politics. In the past 10 years, we've been very fortunate to participate in a movement to reclaim the meaning of human rights through engagement with community struggles for social justice. Let me briefly describe what this means in practice. In Ecuador, we worked with a coalition of indigenous peoples, environmental groups, and scientists to document massive toxic dumping by oil companies in the Amazon rainforest, establish a community monitoring network, and launch a national human rights campaign that forced the government and companies to reform their unlawful practices. In the occupied territories, we worked with a network of over 70 Palestinian organizations to prepare the first reports documenting and challenging Israeli violations of economic and social rights. We also serve on the steering committee of the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation, a national effort to change unjust American policy. In Nigeria, jointly with a local human rights group, we submitted the first economic and social rights petition to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, resulting in a landmark ruling that condemned the government for violating the Ogoni people's rights to adequate food, health, and housing. We helped establish the International Network on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, a new global alliance of organizations and individuals committed to eliminating poverty through human rights. As Secretariat of the network, CESR is bringing several hundred activists to Thailand next month to share strategies and build solidarity. And right here in the United States, where unprecedented material wealth coexists far too comfortably with the highest levels of child poverty and economic inequality in the industrialized world, CESR works on a wide range of domestic human rights projects. We are an active member of the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, a national initiative led by grassroots organizations and inspired by the Reverend Martin Luther King's appeal just before his murder for a new mass movement to achieve economic rights for all Americans. In this work, our guiding purpose is not only to enforce human rights law and change destructive policies, but equally to help marginalized communities and the broader public reconceptualize the struggle against poverty as a matter of justice rather than charity. Justice is in short supply these days, especially where the US government is concerned. Now that American cruise missiles have liberated Iraq, our government will try to convince the public to forget all those promises about democracy and instead start getting very scared and very angry about Iran or Syria or perhaps France. CESR will do its utmost to keep faith with the people of Iraq by holding the Anglo-American military occupation accountable under international law, first for ending the occupation as soon as possible, and this is the duty of all of us, and in the meantime, for guaranteeing human rights to education and health rather than corporate rights to profit and plunder. We will be working very closely with one of the most respected authorities on Iraq, former UN Humanitarian Coordinator Hans von Sponik, who is with us tonight, and his predecessor, Dennis Halliday, to establish an office in Iraq and continue to advocate for human rights. We know that you share our concerns and hope that you will support this work. Margaret Mead has famously said that we should never underestimate the ability of a small group of committed people to change the world. Today in Washington, there is a small group of fanatics and fundamentalists putting her idea into practice with terrifying results. But they have set into motion not just the destruction that we can all witness, but also a popular liberation that is not yet fully visible. This liberation depends on each and every one of us. We cannot afford the luxury of despair. We are responsible to our children, to each other, and most of all to the world itself, which did not allow us to be born so that we might allow it to be destroyed. Finally, we must never underestimate the ability of a large group of committed people to change our world. And so tonight represents an important step in our collective march toward justice. Speaking of a better world, I'd like to take a moment now to recognize some of the folks who have contributed so much to this event and apologize to the many more who are appreciated but must go unnamed. In choosing a venue, we first turned to Carol Nixon, Director of the Mission and Social Justice Commission of the Riverside Church. We thank Carol and the social justice staff, especially Quellen Purdy and Marie Burgos, as well as the Commission's Global Peace and Justice Ministry, for making this event possible with grace and good humor. We also thank Reverend Forbes, Michelle Ivey, Tanoa Rogers, Rob Vivona, and the entire staff at the Riverside Church for their tremendous hospitality in allowing over 3,000 of us to celebrate with them here tonight. For 25 years, South End Press has brought us the words of Arundhati Roy, Howard Zinn, and so many other sane voices in insane times. After the program ends at 8:30, South End books, including War Talk and Power Politics, will be available right here in the Cloister Lounge, courtesy of the community bookstore of Park Slope. You will also find informational materials there from CESR and several other organizations. Our thanks to Pacifica Foundation, WBAI, and Democracy Now! Not just for broadcasting tonight's program, but more importantly for breaking the corporate media monopoly through the People's Radio. Yara Lee and Caipirinha Productions came to our rescue in a crunch, and we're grateful for their generous support of CESR. Last and most, thanks and praises to Anthony Arnov, who knows the true meaning of progressive solidarity because he lives it every day, and to Jacob Park for all his hard work, and above all, to Brenda Coughlin, who really pulled this event together with remarkable talent, enthusiasm, and a great big heart. Before turning the podium over to Patrick Lannon, Let us all salute the generosity of the Lannan Foundation for supporting this event. We also thank Lannan's board and staff, especially Lori Betlak, Joan Evans, Frank Lawler, for the courage to recognize visionary and humane writers and to promote cultural freedom, creative expression, and the rights of Indigenous communities. So let me close by expressing deep appreciation to Arundhati Roy for inspiring all of us to work towards a better world with her insight, passion, and compassion. Thank you.
Good evening. Slowing down a little bit, but I'm Patrick Lannan from the Lannan Foundation in Santa Fe, and I can't tell you how honored I am to be here tonight. I want to thank Reverend Forbes for his generosity and the whole community of this church for having us here. I'm thinking as I'm standing here that I was asking the Reverend when we were sitting over here that this is the very place that Martin Luther King stood in 1967, April 4th to be exact, and gave, I think, one of the most important and prophetic speeches in American history of why I'm against the war in Vietnam. And all I can think now is if we'd only listened to him, I think this would be a different country today. I have no doubt about it. I too want to thank CESR. I think the Center for Economic and Social Rights does some incredible work, and it was very interesting that Arundhati wanted to be supportive of their work at this time. We've worked closely with Brenda Coughlin, and I especially want to thank her. She's a terrific person, and she's been just wonderful. And also all the other people, obviously, who've worked so hard to make this happen in such a timely manner. Since I stand between you and Arundhati Roy, I'm going to be very brief, so don't relax. I thought since we gave her in 2002 our Cultural Freedom Award, that what I do is I just mention a few things probably all of you know, and maybe a few of the observations we had that made it so easy for us to decide to give her our 4th Cultural Freedom Prize. Needless to say, Arundhati is quite contemporary. She's kind of a contemporary Renaissance woman, in my opinion. I know that she studied architecture as a student. She's worked at one time, did some film acting. Done some screenwriting. And I've even been told from good sources that she occasionally was an aerobics instructor. When the muse finally came to her, she took up her pen, and she's only written one novel, The God of Small Things. Of course, she won one of the most prestigious book prizes in the world, the Booker, in 1997 for that book. She subsequently, with all of her energy and total commitment, she brought her communication skills, her literary notoriety, to the fierce struggle in India against those very environmentally destructive and very uneconomic the mega dam projects that are funded so often by the World Bank for reasons that nobody really can understand who analyzes them. Projects which have already displaced millions of indigenous and poor people in India, causing great environmental damage. She's worked so hard in that area. And we had observed that. We noticed, it's clear that she, as much as anybody I know of, understands that the most destructive of the fundamentalisms that plague the world right now is really the newest fundamentalism, and it's the most dangerous. It's corporate globalization. Of course, she tends to aptly term it imperialism, and I think either one implies. She notes so often in her essays how this fundamentalism fatally threatens all cultures, all cultural and biological diversity, and ultimately, I think, life itself on this planet. Her grassroots experience of the brutal realities of the New World Order have led her away from fiction. I don't know when she'll return to fiction, but as she continues to devote herself to activism in behalf of the powerless, as she works for peace and social justice and economic justice, this famous novelist has now become an incredible essayist. Her essays are widely read and they're highly regarded, and a number of them have been assembled and published in books, and I'll mention just Power Politics, The Cost of Living, and her newest and most recent book, War Talk. I commend them to anybody who hasn't read them. Arundhati also knows that the struggle at hand, the struggle we're all talking about tonight in different ways, has to go on at every level, from the grassroots up. And to that end, is an example of the kind of person she is. She gave 100% of the award that we gave her for our Cultural Freedom Prize and distributed it among about 50 organizations in India. In our opinion, she's a person who clearly believes in solidarity, not in old-fashioned charity. She's a true supporter of the collective struggle. She's someone who knows and works with people on the front lines. She's got great generosity. She writes and speaks about power, of its abuses, about its continuing accumulation of this power in fewer and fewer hands, ever more powerful corporations and states, and of the resultant ruthlessness and corruption that comes from this. As Edward Galeano has written, it is not that the powerless are silent, it's just that they are not heard. Well, here tonight, having Arundhati Roy, whose penetrating analysis, compassion, and eloquence, I think will once again give the powerless a voice that can be heard. And so encourage all who believe and are willing to work for their beliefs that we can and should have a better and more equitable world. Please join me in welcoming Arundhati Roy. Thank you.
That was a bit premature. I couldn't hear anything backstage, so I hope they were being nice about me. It's a little intimidating to see so many faces, but what an honor to be here, and thank you so much for coming, because I believe that you're here not for me, but for the political project that all of us must engage in. I have so much to say to you. I can't say all of it, but I just want to thank all those who've organized everything so that all of us could be here together. And since I'm a writer, written out what I want to say, because they are complicated things and we must be precise about our politics. In these times when we have to race to keep abreast of the speed at which our freedoms are being snatched from us, and when few can afford the luxury of retreating from the streets for a while in order to return with an exquisite, fully formed political thesis, replete with footnotes and references, what profound gift can I offer you tonight? As we lurch from crisis to crisis, beamed directly into our brains by satellite TV, we have to think on our feet, on the move. We enter histories through the rubble of war. Ruined cities, parched fields, shrinking forests, and dying rivers are our archives. Craters left by daisy cutters are libraries. So what can I offer you tonight? Some uncomfortable thoughts about money, war, empire, racism, and democracy. some worries that flit around my brain like a family of persistent moths that keep me awake at night. Some of you will think it bad manners for a person like me, officially entered in the big book of nations as an Indian citizen, to come here and criticize the US government. But speaking for myself, I'm no flag waver, no patriot, and I'm fully aware that venality, brutality, and hypocrisy are imprinted on the leaden soul of every nation. But when a country ceases to be merely a country and becomes an empire, then the scale of operations changes dramatically. So may I clarify that tonight I speak as a subject of the American empire. I speak as a slave who presumes to criticize her king. Since lectures must be called something, mine tonight is called Instant Mix Imperial Democracy. Buy one, get one free. Way back in 1988, on the 3rd of July, the USS Vincennes, a missile cruiser stationed in the Persian Gulf, accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner and killed 290 civilian passengers. George Bush I, who was at the time on his presidential campaign, was asked to comment on the incident. He said, quite subtly, "I will never apologize for the United States. I don't care what the facts are." I don't care what the facts are. What a perfect maxim for the new American empire. Perhaps a slight variation on the theme would be more apposite. The facts can be whatever we want them to be. When the United States invaded Iraq, a New York Times CBS News survey estimated that 42% of the American public believed that Saddam Hussein was directly responsible for the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And an ABC News poll said that 55% of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein directly supported Al-Qaeda. None of this opinion is based on evidence, because there isn't any. All of it is based on insinuation, autosuggestion, and outright lies, circulated by the US corporate media, otherwise known as the free press, that hollow pillar on which contemporary American democracy rests. Public support in the US for the war against Iraq was founded on a multi-tiered edifice of falsehood and deceit, coordinated by the US government and faithfully amplified by the corporate media. Apart from the invented links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, we had the manufactured frenzy about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. George Bush the Lesser went to the extent of saying it would be suicidal for the US not to attack Iraq. We once again witnessed the paranoia that a starved, bombed, besieged country was about to annihilate almighty America. Iraq was only the latest in a succession of countries. Earlier there was Cuba, Nicaragua, Libya, Grenada, Panama. But this time, it wasn't just your ordinary brand of friendly neighborhood frenzy. It was frenzy with a purpose. It ushered in an old doctrine in a new bottle, the doctrine of preemptive strike, also known as the United States can do whatever the hell it wants, and that's official. The war against Iraq has been fought and won, and no weapons of mass destruction have been found, not even a little one. Perhaps they'll have to be planted before they're discovered. And then the more troublesome amongst us will need an explanation for why Saddam Hussein didn't use them when his country was being invaded. Of course, there'll be no answers. True believers will make do with those fuzzy TV reports about the discovery of a few barrels of banned chemicals in an old shed. There seems to be no consensus yet about whether they're really chemicals, whether they're actually banned, and whether the vessels they are contained in can technically be called barrels. There were unconfirmed rumors that a teaspoonful of potassium permanganate and an old harmonica were found there too. Meanwhile, in passing, an ancient civilization has been casually decimated by a very recent, casually brutal nation. Then there are those who say, so what if Iraq had no chemical and nuclear weapons? So what if there's no Al-Qaeda connection? So what if Osama bin Laden hates Saddam Hussein as much as he hates the United States? Bush the Lesser has said Saddam Hussein was a homicidal dictator, and so the reasoning goes, Iraq needed a regime change. Never mind that 40 years ago, under the CIA under President John F. Kennedy, orchestrated a regime change in Baghdad. In 1963, after a successful coup, the Ba'ath Party came to power in Iraq. Using lists provided by the CIA, the new Ba'ath regime systematically eliminated hundreds of doctors, lawyers, teachers, and political figures known to be leftists. An entire intellectual community was slaughtered. The same technique was used to massacre hundreds of thousands of people in Indonesia and East Timor. The young Saddam Hussein was said to have had a hand in supervising the bloodbath. But in 1979, after factional infighting within the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein became the president of Iraq. In April 1980, while he was massacring Shias, the US National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, declared, "We see no fundamental incompatibility of the interests between the United States and Iraq." Washington and London overtly and covertly supported Saddam Hussein. They financed him, equipped him, armed him, and provided him with dual-use materials to manufacture weapons of mass destruction. They supported his worst excesses financially, materially, and morally. They supported the 8-year war against Iran and the 1988 gassing of Kurdish people in Halabja, crimes which 14 years later were reheated and served up as reasons to justify invading Iraq. After the first Gulf War, the Allies fomented an uprising of Shias in Basra and then looked away while Saddam Hussein crushed the revolt and slaughtered thousands in an act of vengeful reprisal. The point is, if Saddam Hussein was evil enough to merit the most elaborate, openly declared assassination attempt in history, the opening move of Operation Shock and Awe, then surely those who supported him ought at least to be tried for war crimes. Why aren't the faces of US and UK government officials on that infamous pack of cards of wanted men and women? Because when it comes to empire, facts don't matter. Yes, but all that's in the past, we are told. Saddam Hussein is a monster who must be stopped now, and only the US can stop him. It's an effective technique, this use of the urgent morality of the present to obscure the diabolical sins of the past and the malevolent plans for the future. Indonesia, Panama, Nicaragua, Iraq, Afghanistan, the list goes on and on. Right now, there are brutal regimes being groomed for the future. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, the Central Asian republics. US Attorney General John Ashcroft recently declared that US freedoms are, and I quote, "not the grant of any government or document, but our endowment from God." Why bother with the United Nations when God himself is on hand? So here we are, the people of the world, confronted with an empire armed with a mandate from heaven, and as added insurance, the most formidable arsenal of weapons of mass destruction in history. Here we are, confronted with an empire that has conferred upon itself the right to go to war at will, and the right to deliver people from corrupting ideologies, from religious fundamentalists, dictators, sexism, and poverty, by the age-old, tried and tested practice of extermination. Empire is on the move, and democracy is its sly new war cry. Democracy home delivered to your doorstep by daisy cutters. Death is a small price for people to pay for the privilege of sampling this new product, instant mix imperial democracy. Bring to a boil, add oil, then bomb. But then, perhaps, chinks, Negroes, dinks, gooks, and wogs don't really qualify as real people. Perhaps our deaths don't qualify as real deaths. Our histories don't qualify as history. They never have. Speaking of history, in these past months, while the world watched the US invasion and occupation of Iraq was broadcast on live television. Like Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan, the regime of Saddam Hussein simply disappeared. This was followed by what analysts call a power vacuum. Cities that had been under siege without food, water, and electricity for days. Cities that had been bombed relentlessly. People who had been starved and systematically impoverished by the UN-sanctioned regime for more than a decade were suddenly left with no semblance of urban administration. A 7,000-year-old civilization slid into anarchy on live TV. Vandals plundered shops, offices, hotels, and hospitals. American and British soldiers stood by and watched. They said they had no orders to act. In effect, they had orders to kill people but not to protect them. Their priorities were clear. The safety and security of Iraqi people was not their business. The security of whatever little remained of Iraq's infrastructure was not their business. But the security and safety of Iraq's oil fields were. Of course they were. The oil fields were secured almost before the invasion began. On CNN and BBC, the scenes of the rampage were played and replayed. TV commentators, army and government spokespersons portrayed it as a liberated people venting their rage at a despotic regime. US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said, and I quote, "It's untidy, freedom's untidy, and free people are free to commit crimes and make mistakes and do bad things." Did anybody know that Donald Rumsfeld was an anarchist? I wonder, did he hold the same view during the riots in Los Angeles following the beating of Rodney King? Would he care to share his thesis about the untidiness of freedom with the 2 million people being held in US prisons right now? The world's freest country has the highest number of prisoners in the world. Would he discuss its merits with young African American men, 28% of whom will spend some part of their adult lives in jail? Could he explain why he serves under a president who oversaw 152 executions when he was governor of Texas? Before the war on Iraq began, the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, the ORHA, sent the Pentagon a list of 16 crucial sites to protect. The National Museum was second on that list. And yet the museum was not just looted, it was desecrated. It was a repository of an ancient cultural heritage. Iraq, as we know it today, was part of the River Valley civilization of Mesopotamia, the civilization that grew along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates, produced the world's first writing, first calendar, first library, first city, and yes, the world's first democracy. King Hammurabi of Babylon was the first to codify laws governing the social life of citizens. It was a code in which abandoned women, prostitutes, slaves, and even animals had rights. The Hammurabi Code is acknowledged not just as the birth of legality, but the beginning of an understanding of the concept of social justice. The US government could not have chosen a more inappropriate land in which to stage its illegal war and display its grotesque disregard for justice of any kind. At a Pentagon briefing during the days of looting, Secretary Rumsfeld, Prince of Darkness, turned on his media cohorts who had served him so loyally through the war. And this is what he said. The images you're seeing on television, you're seeing over and over and over, and it's the same picture of some person walking out of some building with a vase, and you see it 20 times, and you say, my God, were there that many vases? Is it possible that there were that many vases in the whole country? Laughter rippled through the press room. Would it be all right for the poor of Harlem to loot the Metropolitan Museum? Would it be greeted with similar mirth? The last building on the ORHA list of 16 sites to be protected was the Ministry of Oil. It was the only one that was given protection. Perhaps the occupying army thought that in Muslim countries lists are read upside down. Television tells us that Iraq has been liberated and that Afghanistan is well on its way to becoming a paradise for women. Thanks to Bush and Blair, the 21st century's leading feminists. In reality, Iraq's infrastructure has been destroyed, its people brought to the brink of starvation, its food stocks depleted, and its cities devastated by a complete administrative breakdown. Iraq is being ushered in the direction of a civil war between Shias and Sunnis. Meanwhile, Afghanistan has lapsed back into an era of anarchy, and its territory has been carved up into fiefdoms by hostile warlords. Undaunted by all this, on the 2nd of May, Bush the Lesser launched his 2004 campaign, hoping to be finally elected US president. In what probably constitutes the shortest flight in history, a military jet landed on an aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which was so close to the shore that, according to the Associated Press, administration officials acknowledged, quote, positioning the massive ship to provide the best TV angle for Bush's speech with the sea as his background instead of the San Diego coastline. President Bush, who never served his term in the military, emerged from the cockpit in fancy dress, a US military bomber jacket, combat boots, flying goggles, helmet. Waving to his cheering troops, he officially proclaimed victory over Iraq. He was careful to say that it was, quote, just one victory in the war on terror, which still goes on. It was important to avoid making a straightforward victory announcement because under the Geneva Convention, a victorious army is bound by legal obligations of an occupying force, a responsibility that the Bush administration doesn't want to burden itself with. And also closer to the 2004 elections, in order to woo wavering voters, another victory in the war against terror might be necessary. Syria is being fattened for the kill. It was Hermann Göring, that old Nazi, who said, "People can always be brought to the bidding of leaders. All you have to do is to tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for a lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country." He's right. It's dead easy. That's what the Bush regime banks on. The distinction between election campaigns and war, between democracy and oligarchy, seems to be closing fast. The only caveat in these campaign wars is that US lives must not be lost. It shakes voter confidence. But the problem of US soldiers being killed in combat has been licked, more or less. At a media briefing before Operation Shock and Awe was unleashed, General Tommy Franks announced, "This campaign will be like no other in history." Maybe he's right. I'm no military historian, but when was the last time a war was fought like this? After using the good offices of UN diplomacy, economic sanctions, and weapons inspections to ensure that Iraq was brought to its knees, its people starved, 500,000 children dead, its infrastructure severely damaged, after making sure that most of its weapons had been destroyed, in an act of cowardice that must surely be unrivaled in history, the coalition of the willing, better known as the coalition of the bullied and bought, sent in an invading army. Operation Iraqi Freedom? I don't think so. It was more like Operation Let's Run a Race, but first let me break your knees. As soon as the war began, the governments of France, Germany, and Russia, which refused to allow a final resolution legitimizing the war to be passed in the UN Security Council, fell over each other to say how much they wanted the United States to win. President Jacques Chirac offered French airspace to the Anglo-American Air Force. US military bases in Germany were open for business. German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer publicly hoped for the rapid collapse of the Saddam Hussein regime. Vladimir Putin publicly hoped for the same. These are governments that colluded in the enforced disarming of Iraq before their dastardly rush to take the side of those who attacked it. Apart from hoping to share the spoils, they hoped empire would honor their pre-war oil contracts with Iraq. Only the very naive could expect old imperialists to behave otherwise. Leaving aside the cheap thrills and the lofty moral speeches made in the UN during the run-up to the war, eventually, at the moment of crisis, the unity of Western governments, despite the opposition from the majority of their people, was overwhelming. When the Turkish government temporarily bowed to the views of 90% of its population and turned down the US government's offer of billions of dollars of blood money for the use of Turkish soil, it was accused of lacking democratic principles. According to a Gallup international poll, in no European country was the support for a war carried out unilaterally by America and its allies higher than 11%. But the governments of England, Italy, Spain, Hungary, and other countries of Eastern Europe were praised for disregarding the views of the majority of their people and supporting the illegal invasion. That, presumably, was fully in keeping with democratic principles. What's it called? New democracy, like Britain's New Labour? In stark contrast to the venality displayed by their governments, on the 15th of February, weeks before the invasion, in the most spectacular display of public morality the world has ever seen, more than 10 million people marched against the war on 5 continents. Many of you, I'm sure, were among them. We were disregarded with utter disdain. When asked to react to the anti-war demonstrations, President Bush said, quote, "It's like deciding, well, I'm going to decide policy based upon a focus group. The role of a leader is to decide policy based upon the security, in this case, the security of the people." Democracy, the modern world's holy cow, is in crisis, and the crisis is a profound one. Every kind of outrage is being committed in the name of democracy. It has become little more than a hollow word, a pretty shell emptied of all content or meaning. It can be whatever you want it to be. Democracy is the free world's whore, willing to dress up, dress down, willing to satisfy a whole range of taste, available to be used and abused at will. Until quite recently, right up to the 1980s, democracy did seem as though it might actually succeed in delivering a degree of real social justice. But modern democracies have been around for long enough for neoliberal capitalists to learn how to subvert them. They have mastered the technique of infiltrating the instruments of democracy, the independent judiciary, the free press, the parliament, and molding them to their purpose. The project of corporate globalization has cracked the code. Free elections, a free press, and an independent judiciary mean little when the free market has reduced them to commodities available on sale to the highest bidder. To fully comprehend the extent to which democracy is under siege, it might be an idea to look at what goes on in some of our contemporary democracies. The world's largest, India, which I have written about at some length and therefore will not speak about tonight. The world's most interesting, South Africa. The world's most powerful, the USA, and most instructive of all the plans that are being made to usher in the world's newest, Iraq. In South Africa, after 300 years of brutal domination of the black majority by a white minority through colonialism and apartheid, a non-racial, multi-party democracy came to power in 1994. It was a phenomenal achievement. Within 2 years of coming to power, the African National Congress had genuflected with no caveats to the market god. Its massive program of structural adjustment, privatization, and liberalization has only increased the hideous disparities between the rich and the poor. More than 1 million people have lost their jobs. The corporatization of basic services, electricity, water, and housing, has meant that 10 million South Africans, almost a quarter of the population, has been disconnected from water and electricity. 2 million have been evicted from their homes. Meanwhile, a small white minority that has been historically privileged by centuries of brutal exploitation are more secure than ever before. They continue to control the land, the farms, the factories, and the abundant natural resources of that country. For them, the transition from apartheid to neoliberalism barely disturbed the grass. It's apartheid with a clean conscience, and it goes by the name of democracy. Democracy has become empire's euphemism for neoliberal capitalism. In countries of the First World, too, the machinery of democracy has been effectively subverted. Politicians, media barons, judges, powerful corporate lobbies, and government officials are imbricated in an elaborate underhand configuration that completely undermines the lateral arrangement of checks and balances between the Constitution, courts of law, Parliament, the administration, and perhaps most important of all, the independent media that form the structural basis of a parliamentary democracy. Increasingly, the imbrication is neither subtle nor elaborate. Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, for instance, has a controlling interest in major Italian newspapers, magazines, television channels, publishing houses. The Financial Times reported that he controls about 90% of Italy's television viewership. Recently, during a trial on bribery charges, while insisting he was the only person who could save Italy from the left, he said, "How much longer do I have to keep living this life of sacrifices?" That bodes ill for the remaining 10% of Italy's TV viewership. What price? Free speech. Free speech for whom? In the United States, the arrangement is more complex. Clear Channel Worldwide Incorporated is the largest radio station owner in the country. It runs more than 1,200 channels, which together account for 9% of the market. Its CEO contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to Bush's election campaign. When hundreds of thousands of American citizens took to the streets to protest against the war on Iraq, Clear Channel organized pro-war patriotic rallies for America across the country. It used its radio stations to advertise the events and then sent correspondents to cover them as though they were breaking news. The era of manufacturing consent has given way to the era of manufacturing news. Soon, media newsrooms will drop the pretense and start hiring theater directors instead of journalists. As America's show business gets more and more violent and warlike, and America's wars get more and more like show business, some interesting crossovers are taking place. The designer who built the $250,000 set in Qatar, from which General Tommy Franks stage-managed news coverage of Operations Shock and Awe, also built sets for Disney, MGM, and Good Morning America. It's a cruel irony that the US, which has the most ardent, vociferous defenders of the idea of free speech, and until recently the most elaborate legislation to protect it, has so circumscribed the space in which that freedom can be expressed. In a strange way, the sound and fury that accompanies the legal and conceptual defense of free speech in America serves to mask the process of the rapid erosion of the possibilities of actually exercising that freedom. The news and entertainment industry in the US is for the most part controlled by a few major corporations: AOL, Time Warner, Disney, Viacom, News Corporation. Each of these corporations owns and controls TV stations, film studios, record companies, and publishing ventures. Effectively, the exits are sealed. America's media empire is controlled by a tiny coterie of people. Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Michael Powell, the son, by coincidence of course, of the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, has proposed even further deregulation of the telecommunications industry, which will lead to even greater consolidation. So here it is, the world's greatest democracy, led by a man who was not legally elected. America's Supreme Court gifted him his job. What price have American people paid for this spurious presidency? In the 3 years of George Bush the Lesser's term, the American economy has lost more than 2 million jobs. Outlandish military expenses, corporate welfare, and tax giveaways to the rich have created a financial crisis for the US educational system. According to a survey by the National Council of State Legislatures, US states cut $49 billion in public services, health, welfare benefits, and education in 2002. They plan to cut another $25.7 billion this year. That makes a total of $75 billion. Bush's initial budget request to the Congress to finance the war in Iraq was $80 billion. So who's paying for the war? America's poor, its students, its unemployed, its single mothers, its hospital and home care patients, its teachers and health workers. And who's actually fighting the war? Once again, America's poor. The soldiers who are baking in Iraq's desert sun are not the children of the rich. Only one of all the representatives in Congress and the Senate has a child fighting in Iraq. America's volunteer army in fact depends on a poverty draft of poor whites, blacks, Latinos, and Asians who are looking for a way to earn a living and get an education. Federal statistics show that African Americans make up 21% of the total armed forces and 29% of the US Army, and they count for only 12% of the general population. It's ironic, isn't it, the disproportionately high representation of African Americans in the army and prison? Perhaps we should take a positive view and look at this as affirmative action at its most effective. Nearly 4 million Americans, 2% of the population, have lost the right to vote because of felony convictions. Of that number, 1.4 million are African Americans, which means that 13% of all voting-age black people have been disenfranchised. For African Americans, there's also affirmative action in death. A study by the economist Amartya Sen shows that African Americans as a group have a lower life expectancy than people born in China, in the Indian state of Kerala, where I come from, Sri Lanka, or Costa Rica. Bangladeshi men have a better chance of making it to the age of 40 than African American men from here in Harlem. This year, on what would have been Martin Luther King's 74th birthday, President Bush announced the University of Michigan's affirmative action program favoring blacks and Latinos. He denounced it. He called it divisive, unfair, and unconstitutional. The successful effort to keep blacks off the voting lists in the state of Florida in order that George Bush be elected was, of course, neither unfair nor unconstitutional. I don't suppose affirmative action for white boys from Yale ever is. So now we know who's paying for the war, we know who's fighting it, but who will benefit from it? Who is homing in on the reconstruction contracts estimated to be worth up to $100 billion? Could it be America's poor and unemployed and sick? Could it be America's single mothers or America's black and Latino minorities? Operation Iraqi Freedom, George Bush assures us, is about returning Iraqi oil to the Iraqi people. That is, returning Iraqi oil to the Iraqi people via corporate multinationals like Bechtel, like Chevron, like Halliburton. Once again, it's a small, tight circle that connects corporate, military, and government leadership to one another. The promiscuousness, the cross-pollination is outrageous. Consider this. The Defense Policy Board is a government-appointed group that advises the Pentagon on defense policy. Its members are appointed by the Undersecretary of Defense and approved by Donald Rumsfeld. Its meetings are classified. No information is available for public scrutiny. The Washington-based Center for Public Integrity found that 9 out of the 30 members of the Defense Policy Board are connected to companies that were awarded defense contracts worth $76 billion between the years 2001 and 2002. One of them, Jack Sheehan, a retired Marine Corps general, is a senior vice president at Bechtel, the giant international engineering outfit. Riley Bechtel, the company chairman, is on the President's Export Council. Former Secretary of State George Shultz, who's also on the board of directors of the Bechtel Group, is the chairman of the advisory board on the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq. When asked by the New York Times whether he was concerned about the appearance of a conflict of interest, he said, "I don't know that Bechtel would particularly benefit from it, but if there's work to be done, Bechtel is the type of company that could do it." Bechtel has been awarded a $680 million reconstruction contract in Iraq. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, Bechtel contributed $1.3 million towards the 1999-2000 Republican campaign. Arcing across this subterfuge, dwarfing it by the sheer magnitude of its malevolence, is America's anti-terrorism legislation. The USA Patriot Act, passed on October 13, 2001, has become the blueprint for similar anti-terrorism bills in countries across the world. It was passed in the House of Representatives by a majority vote of 337 to 79. According to the New York Times, many lawmakers said that it had been impossible to truly debate or even read the legislation. The Patriot Act ushers in an era of systemic automated surveillance. It gives the government the authority to monitor phones and computers and spy on people in ways that would have seemed completely unacceptable a few years ago. It gives the FBI the power to seize all the circulation, purchasing, and other records of library users and bookstore customers on the suspicion that they are part of a terrorist network. It blurs the boundaries between speech and criminal activity, creating the space to construe acts of civil disobedience as violating the law. Already, hundreds of people are being held indefinitely as unlawful combatants. In India, the number is in the thousands. In Israel, 5,000 Palestinians have been detained. Non-citizens, of course, have no rights at all. They can be simply disappeared, like the people of Chile under Washington's old ally, General Pinochet. More than 1,000 people, many of them of Muslim or of Middle Eastern origin, have been detained, some without access to legal representatives. So apart from paying the actual economic costs of war, American people are paying for these spurious wars of liberation with their own freedoms. For the ordinary American, the price of new democracy in other countries is the death of real democracy at home. Meanwhile, Iraq is being groomed for liberation. Or did they mean liberalization all along? The Wall Street Journal reports that the Bush administration has drafted sweeping plans to remake Iraq's economy in the US image. Iraq's constitution is being redrafted, its trade laws, tax laws, and intellectual property laws being rewritten in order to turn it into an American-style capitalist economy. The United States Agency for International Development has invited US companies to bid for contracts that range between road building, water systems, textbook distribution, and cell phone networks. Soon after, Bush the Lesser announced that he wanted American farmers to feed the world, Dam Amstutz, a former senior executive of Cargill, the biggest grain exporter in the world, was put in charge of agricultural reconstruction in Iraq. Kevin Watkin, Oxfam's policy director, said, putting Dam Amstutz in charge of agricultural reconstruction in Iraq is like putting Saddam Hussein in the chair of a human rights commission. Two men who have been shortlisted to run operations for managing Iraq's oil have worked with Shell, BP, and Fleur. Fleur is embroiled in a lawsuit by black South African workers who have accused the company of exploiting and brutalizing them during the apartheid era. Shell, of course, is well known for its devastation of the Ogoni tribal lands in Nigeria. Tom Brokaw, one of America's best-known anchors, TV anchors, was inadvertently succinct about the process. One of the things we don't want to do, he said, is to destroy the infrastructure of Iraq, because in a few days we are going to own that country. Now that the ownership deeds are being settled, Iraq is ready for new democracy. So, as Lenin used to ask, what is to be done? Well, we might as well accept the fact that there is no conventional military force that can successfully challenge the American war machine. Terrorist strikes only give the US government an opportunity that it is eagerly awaiting to further tighten its stranglehold. Within days of an attack, you can bet that Patriot 2 would be passed. To argue against US military aggression by saying that it will increase the possibilities of terrorist strikes is futile. It's like threatening Brer Rabbit that you throw him into the bramble bush. Anyone who's read the document called the Project for the New American Century can attest to that. The government's suppression of the Congressional Committee report on September 11th, which found that there was an intelligence warning of the strikes that was ignored, also attests to the fact that for all their posturing, the terrorists and the Bush regime might as well be working as a team. They both hold people responsible for the actions of their governments. They both believe in the doctrine of collective guilt and collective punishment. Their actions benefit each other greatly. The US government has already displayed in no uncertain terms the range and extent of its capability for paranoid aggression. In human psychology, paranoid aggression is usually an indicator of nervous insecurity. It could be argued that it's no different in the case of the psychology of nations. Empire is paranoid because it has a soft underbelly. Its homeland may be defended by border patrols and nuclear weapons, but its economy is strung out across the globe. Its economic outposts are exposed and vulnerable. Already, the internet is buzzing with elaborate lists of American and British government products and companies that should be boycotted. Apart from the usual targets, Coke, Pepsi, McDonald's, government agencies like USAID, the British DFID, British and American banks, Arthur Andersen, Merrill Lynch, and American Express could find themselves under siege. These lists are being honed and refined by activists across the world. They could become a practical guide that directs the amorphous but growing fury in the world. Suddenly, the inevitability of the project of corporate globalization is beginning to seem more than a little evitable. It would be naive to imagine that we can directly confront empire. Our strategy must be to isolate empire's working parts and disable them one by one. No target is too small, no victory too insignificant. We could reverse the idea of the economic sanctions imposed on poor countries by empire and its allies. We could impose a regime of people sanctions on every corporate house that has been awarded with a contract in post-war Iraq. Just as activists in this country and around the world targeted and exposed institutions of apartheid. Each one of them should be named, exposed, and boycotted, forced out of business. That could be our response to the shock and awe campaign. It would be a great beginning. Another urgent challenge is to expose the corporate media for the boardroom bulletin that it really is. We need to create a universe of alternative information. We need to support independent media like Democracy Now!, Alternative Radio, South End Press. The battle to reclaim democracy is going to be a difficult one. our freedoms were not granted to us by any governments. They were wrested from them by us. And once we surrender them, the battle to retrieve them is called a revolution. It's a battle that must range across continents and countries. It must not acknowledge national boundaries. But if it is to succeed, it has to begin here in America. The only institution more powerful than the US government is American civil society. The rest of us are subjects of slave nations. We are by no means powerless, but you have the power of proximity. You have access to the imperial palace and the emperor's chambers. Empire's conquests are being carried out in your name, and you have the right to refuse. You could refuse to fight, refuse to move those missiles from the warehouse to the dock. Refuse to wave that flag, refuse the victory parade. You have a rich tradition of resistance. You only need to read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. To remind yourself of this, hundreds of thousands of you have survived the relentless propaganda you've been subjected to and are actively fighting your own government. In the ultra-patriotic climate that prevails in the United States, that's as brave as any Iraqi or Afghan or Palestinian fighting for his or her homeland. If you join the battle, not in your hundreds of thousands, but in your millions, you will be greeted joyously by the rest of the world. And you will see how beautiful it is to be gentle instead of brutal, safe instead of scared, befriended instead of isolated, loved instead of hated. I hate to disagree with your president. Yours is by no means a great nation, but you could be a great people. History is giving you the chance. Seize the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Arundhati. Now I'd like to introduce Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn, activist, author, professor, and people's historian, is fond of reminding us of George Orwell's famous quote, "Whoever controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Professor Zinn has spent his long, productive, and inspiring career teaching us that history is not the story told by the powerful, but the collective life experiences of ordinary people, and that knowledge itself is the most powerful force for social change. As we continue to reclaim our history tonight, we now turn to a discussion between Howard Zinn and Arundhati Roy. Please join me in giving Howard Zinn a warm welcome.
Thank you. Well, sitting there in the front row where I belong, and listening to Arundhati, I had not the most profound thought, really. I thought, she speaks so beautifully. And I thought, we're not accustomed to that. No, we who watch our political leaders on television, we're just not accustomed to that. You know. And of course, also, she speaks the truth, and we're certainly not accustomed to that. And we've heard so many truths tonight. Like about democracy and the way it's been used. And as you said, Arundhati, it's become a euphemism for, you know, the free market and all of that. But maybe we need to reclaim the word, right? We need to reclaim the idea of democracy from those people who have stolen it from the American people, you know, and talk about what it really means. And, you know, because we grow up, in the United States, we grow up, I'm not sure how you grow up in India. You can tell us how you grew up in India. But, you know, we grow up in the United States and everybody's told, look, it's very simple. We live in a democratic country. There are lots of other countries around, and, you know, they're not democratic, but we live in democracy. And so this is a very good time to really start thinking about democracy, start people thinking about democracy, sort of part of that process you were talking about, you know, of, reacting to what is going on in the world, informing people, and reminding people that democracy is not the control of politics by a small number of very rich people in the country, and reminding them that democracy is not the control of the economy by a small number of corporations, and democracy is not the control of our minds by a small number, you know, of powerful media, and reminding them that democracy is what we see when people organize, get together, take risks, go to jail, commit civil disobedience, do the kinds of things you're talking about, boycott and strike and general strikes and all of those things, you know, democracy is not what they put on the blackboard in junior high school when they show us the three branches of government. Democracy, no, that's not. Democracy comes alive when people do as people did in the labor movement in this country, and what people did in the movement against racial segregation, what people did in the movement against the war. I mean, that's when democracy comes alive. And it comes alive when people speak the truth. to one another and spread the truth. So I'm very grateful, Arundhati, for you doing that for us here. But I'm really here. You know, I really should be asking you things. I shouldn't be. You're happy to keep. I thought, that's why I'm doing this. I thought you would need a little rest. Okay. But only a little rest. Because I want to ask you about democracy in India, and if it's used the same way. Because we in the United States, when we talk, oh, there are democratic countries, India is a democratic country, right? How do you look, what's going on there? What's going on with democracy in India?
Democracy in India is in serious trouble in a very different way from here. Because in a way it's the opposite. It's not a small number of people and corporations controlling the media, but what it is a sort of majoritarianism. Last year, around this time, actually in April, February, March, April, I don't think many of you in America would have read this because, you know, India's open to the corporate markets. So now when Indian governments slaughter people, it doesn't make it to the news unless there was Saddam Hussein, it wouldn't make it to the news. But in February last year, supervised by the state of Gujarat, the BJP, which is a right-wing Hindu government in power in the center as well, slaughtered 2,000 Muslims. 150,000 were driven from their homes. And this whole process was supervised by the government. They had cadastral lists of Muslim partnerships, Muslim businesses, Muslim homes. Each of these was targeted and burnt. Women were gang raped and burnt alive on the streets. There's evidence, there's masses of evidence. Nothing happened. No one was charged. The chief minister who oversaw all this, a man called Narendra Modi, was then voted back to power. So this is the frightening thing about democracy. When the courts mean nothing, when the constitution means nothing, when democracy just means elections, then you can get majoritarianism of a kind. A young child asked me, Arundhati, is Narendra Modi worse than Bush? Which of these two is the worst? So I said, what do you mean? He said, well, Modi kills his own people and Bush kills other people. So which of them is worse? So I said, well, you'll have to just look at it like this, that they both kill people. They're both murderers, We don't have to choose between the two of them. But there is a very, very frightening time in India right now, a kind of, everything is being arbitrated by these rampaging mobs, Hindu right-wing mobs. And therefore today, strangely enough, while this is happening, at no time has the government of India been closer to the government of the United States, ever. Because actually these right-wing governments find so much in common with each other. So the Indian government has never before done this, but now it's aligning itself between Israel and America. With Israel and America.
I wonder if that young kid who asked you that question, well, that must have known, right? She knew what was going on. How many people in India knew what was going on? How was this reported? How was that incident reported in India?
Well, it's quite interesting that in India, this government came to power in 1998. And the first thing that it did was the series of nuclear tests. And those had nothing to do with really needing nuclear bombs. But as the newspapers kept reporting, this is an explosion of self-esteem, and it was all about Hindu nationalism. And so at the time, from 1998 up to 2003, the media has completely supported this project of nationalism and Hinduism and so on. And now, when these killings happened, the sort of English media, which is quite upper elite and middle class, got a little uncomfortable and pulled back, you know. But so it was reported. In local papers, it was reported completely distorted, almost as if it was the other way around, that Muslims were killing Hindus. But the problem was not that nobody knew what was going on. You know, the problem was that there was a kind of consensus, which is the dangerous thing in democracy sometimes. You can't just blame it on Saddam Hussein because people are voting for this.
The reason I asked that is I suppose when it happens there in India, as you say, people know about it, but there's this ferocious nationalism which leads them to accept it. And as this girl pointed out to you, well, Bush kills people in other countries. And when you kill people in other countries, it's easier to conceal what is being done. And it seems to me one of the reasons for the acceptance of the war by so many Americans, or not as many Americans as they would like us to think, but the acceptance of the war by a good number of Americans is that the American population has had concealed from it the human consequences of what we've been doing. It's all been presented as a kind of antiseptic operation. And the bombing of Iraq, just like the bombing of Afghanistan before it, like all bombings, really, are presented as something that really doesn't do anything to human beings. And I think of that really through the prism of my own experience, because I was you probably know this, Arundhati, and my close friends know it because I never let them forget this. But I was in the Air Force, and I was a bombardier in the Air Force. And I did not know what I was doing. I did not know what was happening to people down there. So when I see these pilots coming back from their missions in Iraq, or as they did in Afghanistan, and they're smiling and they're happy and we hit our targets, it reminds me of myself and how flying at 30,000 feet you drop bombs and you don't hear any screams and you don't see any blood. You don't see kids with dismembered limbs, and that's the way modern warfare is carried out. And what happened to me is that I didn't understand the human consequences of what I was doing as a bombardier until I read John Hersey's book, Hiroshima, right after the war. And he went into Hiroshima and he talked to survivors. And you can imagine what those survivors were like. They were people without legs, without arms, people who were blinded, people whose skin was something you could not bear to look at. And he described that. And for the first time, I thought, oh, this is what happens when you bomb.
And President Truman said that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the greatest thing in history.
That's right. And he also said, and that's right, he said also that we have just bombed a military target. And I try to remind people when I'm talking to audiences in the United States that when they hear Rumsfeld and what did you call him? The Prince of Darkness. Yes. When they hear Rumsfeld explain casually, how, well, an accident took place here and an accident took place there. Yes, these people were in a bus were killed. These people in the marketplace were killed. But these are accidents because we only bomb military targets. And And as you say, Hiroshima was a military target. Dresden was a military target. Tokyo was a military target when 100,000 people were killed in one night of bombing in Tokyo. And the definition of military targets is something, that we must remind people about.
But isn't it interesting how, Saving Private Ryan is so kind of detailed with the blood and the gore and the stumps and the everything. The fiction is so real and reality is so absent. Real wars don't seem to be fought anymore according to TV.
I was particularly annoyed by Saving Private Ryan. And because I've been annoyed often in my life, you see, and especially when World War II is paraded before us again and again and again to glorify war, to take sort of that element of morality that there was truly in World War II, the fight against fascism and so on, but one that's been much exaggerated. But to take World War II and to take the element of morality in World War II and to take the glow that World War II still casts on all of us, except me, and to take that glow and to cast it over all these ugly wars that we have fought since World War II. I resent using World War II, in that way, because, and very often I think, this was the good war, right, in quotation marks. So this is the best of wars. But when you examine it closely, when you examine the consequences of it, it seems to me you must ask yourself, okay, this is the best of wars, and at the end of it, 50 million people are dead. And has war ended? Has fascism ended in the world? Well, we're seeing some of it in this country now. Has militarism ended in the world? And so I'm sorry you brought up Saving Private Ryan, because it always leads to this burst of indignation. But I think we need to think not only about the Iraq War, but about war in general, about war, period, and decide that we have reached that point in human history where we cannot tolerate the mass killing of people for whatever cause is presented to us. So, I know I'm supposed to ask you questions, but I'm wondering about your patriotism, and I'm wondering about whether you face the same problem that we do in the United States when we criticize the war or criticize the Bush administration, and we're accused of being un-American and unpatriotic and so on. And
well, I get it both ways. I'm accused of being anti-American and anti-Indian. So, it's a very, when you live outside of America, I'm always brought up short by the racism or the racist response to a racist war, because the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan are seen as racist wars. People find it so easy to just hate Americans. And I, whom all the time vilified for being anti-American, am always in the extraordinary position of defending Americans and defending British people and saying, look, if India and Pakistan were fighting a war, I don't think 100,000 people would show up on the streets to protest, It's always like about 9 of us or something.
It's interesting the way you're defending America by pointing to the people who are America, that is, who represent the best ideals of America, and not the worst. And, and I think this is what very often people lose, and I suppose they do the same thing with India as an abstraction, and when people, and I've been accused of being anti-American, and I respond to that, by saying, we must disagree about what America is. America is not Bush. America is not, America, America is not the government. And, and we must look at the basic principles of democracy. We must look at the Declaration of Independence, which is the fundamental philosophy of democracy, and it says governments are artificial creations. Governments are set up by the people to ensure certain rights, equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. When governments become destructive of those ends, I'm now quoting the Declaration of Independence, when governments become, if it doesn't mind, when governments become destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government. You see, and if and if you have the right to alter or abolish the government, you certainly have the right to criticize the government, But so, the government is being anti-American when it goes against the principles of democracy. That's how I feel about it. So I know, Arundhati, that you are pro-Indian in the best sense, and you are pro-American in the best sense. Yeah.
I try not to think in these categories, actually.
Yeah.
I was in Porto Alegre in January, and a lady asked me to sign a petition against the war in Iraq, and I signed it, and it said name organization, and I wrote Arundhati Roy, Zinn, which stands for the Sweethearts International Network. So I'm actually not a nationalist of any kind. I believe that I think it's very important to stop our minds coming up short against these artificial boundaries. And I think nationalism really does lie at the root of a lot of the troubles of this century and the last one. And we really need to question that. Because
I think maybe one of the ways to remind people of the dangers of nationalism is to ask people if they believe that all people everywhere have an equal right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Not just Americans, but everybody, everywhere in the world. And I think most people would agree. And most people would agree that everybody, and ask people if they believe that that the lives of children in Iraq are equal to the lives of children in the United States or in Russia or in China, you see. And if that is so, if all children everywhere have an equal right to life, then war becomes impossible. Because war is always a war against children. And so, and sometimes when people bring up, most people in the United States still defend the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's troublesome to think that most people in the United States still, because, they've been misinformed, they've been miseducated, they don't really, know what the situation was at that time. And also they aren't thinking in a certain way about the human race. And I ask people very often if when that issue comes up, after we've exhausted all the political and military arguments about what was happening in August of 1945, I said, well, look, if in August of 1945, you knew that we could end the war quickly by killing 100,000 American children, yeah, would you agree? Well, we know what answer people would give, of course not. Then why would we agree to kill 100,000 Japanese children in order to speed the end of the war? And I think the nationalism that you talk about, I think, when we put it in terms of human beings everywhere,
But the fact is that, when Madeleine Albright was asked about the death of 500,000 Iraqi children, she said she thought the price was worth it. And the trouble is that, when you live in a country like India, all the time you are faced with the horrors of living in a feudal society where people do believe that some of them are more equal than others. And, there is the whole issue of race and colonialism, and it is something that all of us need to ask ourselves very, very seriously. But the fact is that it is true today that if you kill 200,000 Iraqis, or you kill 200,000 Afghans, or you kill 200,000 Indians, or you kill 4 million people in the Congo, is not the same thing as 200,000 Americans, or 200,000 British people, or 200,000 Europeans. This is the truth. This is the way it is just now.
And I think, and you pointed to the 10 million or more people who on February 15th demonstrated all around the world against the war. And it must mean that there are huge, huge numbers of people around the world who recognize that. And I just want to say one more thing before I stop saying things. And that is that, which connects with that wonderful day of enormous solidarity, international solidarity, brotherhood, sisterhood, human beings together that day. And there was, surprisingly, in the New York Times, the day after, a reporter said, some of you may have read this, the reporter said, talking about those demonstrations, said there are now two superpowers in the world, the United States and world public opinion. And I thought, Arundhati, it might be nice for you to read something which I think I heard you read, which I would like you to read just for my benefit.
It's just going to be a minute. This is the end of an essay called "The Ladies Have Feelings, So Shall We Leave It to the Experts?" It's really an essay in defense of passion, but this is just about, the role of writers and so on. What is happening to the world lies at the moment just outside the realm of common human understanding. It is the writers, the poets, the artists, the singers, the filmmakers who can make the connections, who can find ways of bringing it into the realm of common understanding, who can translate cash flow charts and scintillating boardroom speeches into real stories about real people with real lives, stories about what it's like to lose your home, your land, your job, your dignity, your past and your future to an invisible force, to someone or something you can't see, you can't hate, you can't even imagine. It's a new space that's been offered to us today, a new kind of challenge. It offers opportunities for a new kind of art, an art which can make the impalpable palpable, make the intangible tangible, and the invisible visible. An art which can draw out the incorporeal adversary and make it real, bring it to book. Cynics say that real life is a choice between the failed revolution and the shabby deal. I don't know, maybe they're right, but even they should know that there's no limit to just how shabby that shabby deal can be. What we need to search for and find, what we need to hone and perfect into a magnificent shining thing is a new kind of politics. Not the politics of governance, but the politics of resistance, the politics of opposition, the politics of forcing accountability, the politics of slowing things down, the politics of joining hands across the world and preventing certain destruction. In the present circumstances, I'd say that the only thing worth globalizing is dissent. Thank you.